This is the Daily Brief, one landmark court decision explained in plain English every day. Presented by FindCourtCases.com, this is your daily briefing on the law that shapes American life.
Okay, let's get right into it. We're doing a deep dive on a case that really reshaped how America thinks about privacy, about liberty, and maybe most importantly, what the government can and cannot police inside your own home.
And we're not starting with legal jargon. We have to start with the stakes. To really get the gravity of Lawrence v. Texas, you have to just, imagine a world where the government can use its police power, the same authority that stops a bank robbery, to criminalize your private consensual life.
And for no other reason than moral disapproval.
Exactly. That is the fundamental conflict here.
The state using its full force to tell two consenting adults what they can do in private. I mean, what was at risk was the basic dignity and liberty of an entire group of citizens.
It was. For decades, many states had laws that were, frankly, literal intrusions into the most personal parts of a person's life.
Yeah.
So when this case finally got to the Supreme Court, the individuals involved, John Geddes Lawrence and Tyron Garner, they won.
They won more than just their case, right? It wasn't just about getting rid of a criminal charge.
Oh, absolutely. They won a landmark protection for their dignity, for their autonomy.
So then who lost?
Well, the state of Texas, obviously. But bigger than that, what really lost was this decades-old legal idea that a state's moral disapproval was enough to justify a criminal law intruding into someone's home.
You're talking about that infamous 1986 case, Bowers v. Hardwick.
That's the one. It was the precedent that allowed these laws to stand for so long.
So if there's one thing, one sentence to take away from our deep dive today, what is it?
It's this. The Supreme Court ruled that making private, consensual same-sex conduct a crime violates the 14th Amendment's guarantee of liberty. And that principle, it's foundational to so many rights debates that are still happening today.
And that's our mission here, to really unpack how this one seemingly small criminal charge in Texas spiraled into one of the most important rulings on personal freedom we've seen.
So let's start the story. We have to go back to 1998 because this whole legal saga, it doesn't begin in some grand courtroom. It starts in a very normal, very human moment in an apartment in Houston.
Right. The narrative kicks off with a police call. A reported weapons disturbance at the home of John Geddes Lawrence.
His private residence. And it's so important to remember that the call itself was bogus.
Yeah, we found out later it was a false report, right? From someone with a grudge.
A completely false alarm. But it was the excuse, the reason the government got to open the door and step inside.
So police enter the apartment, and what they see is not a weapons disturbance. They see Lawrence and Tyron Garner, two adults, engaged in a private, consensual sexual act.
No weapons, no danger to the public, just two people in their own home.
But under Texas law at the time, that private moment was a crime.
It was. They were immediately arrested. The charge was DVA sexual intercourse.
And what made this law so constitutionally shaky was how specific it was.
That's the key. The Texas statute didn't ban this conduct for everyone. It specifically criminalized it only between two people of the same sex. A different sex couple doing the exact same thing was not breaking any law.
Okay, so that's a huge distinction. If it targeted everyone, you might just have a liberty issue under due process.
Right.
But because it singled out one specific group, that brings in the Equal Protection Clause.
Exactly. It adds this whole other layer of, potential discrimination. So Lawrence and Garner, they plead no contest. They get fined about $200.
But they knew this was about more than a fine. It was a permanent record, a stigma.
Of course. It was a profound invasion of their privacy. So they challenged the law immediately, arguing it violated both their right to liberty and their right to equal protection under the 14th Amendment.
But this wasn't an easy path. The case goes to the Texas Court of Appeals, and they actually upheld the convictions.
They did. And it's because their hands were tied, really.
Yeah.
They felt bound by a higher authority.
You mean the Supreme Court precedent we mentioned earlier? That ghost in the machine?
The ghost of Bowers v. Hardwick. For almost 20 years, Bowers was the law of the land. It had explicitly said that states could criminalize same-sex conduct. The Texas court basically said, look, we might not like it, but the Supreme Court has spoken.
So there was nowhere else to go but up. The Supreme Court agrees to hear the case grant certiorari, as they say.
And now the central questions are on the table. Is the Texas law constitutional? And the really big one, should Bowers v. Hardwick be completely thrown out?
To really get why the Lawrence decision was so huge, you have to understand what went so wrong in Bowers.
If you do. The mistake in Bowers back in '86 was how narrowly the court framed the whole issue. They asked, essentially, is there a fundamental constitutional right to engage in sodomy?
Wow. Phrasing it like that makes it sound so detached, so clinical, like they're just regulating one specific physical act.
And that's exactly the problem. By focusing on just the act, the Bowers court completely missed the bigger picture. They disconnected from the context of personal liberty, of privacy, of intimate relationships.
And so they concluded there was no fundamental right.
Right. They said it wasn't mentioned in the Constitution, it wasn't deeply rooted in history, so, case closed, states can regulate it.
So wait, how did the court in Lawrence get around that? If states have the power to legislate morality, the police power, how did they draw a new line without just, inventing a new right?
That is the brilliant analytical leap they made. The Lawrence court reframed the entire question. They realized it wasn't about a specific sexual act. It was about protecting the liberty of adults to form their own private lives and intimate relationships.
So let's translate that. In everyday terms, it means the government wasn't just banning an action. It was effectively telling you who you were allowed to be, how you could express love and intimacy in your own home.
It was imposing a stigma. It was defining a whole class of people by their sexual orientation and marking them as criminals. That's the difference between regulating, say, public indecency and reaching into the privacy of the home to regulate fundamental choices.
The central issue then became whether these men were free, as adults, to engage in this private conduct as part of their liberty that's guaranteed by the Constitution.
And the court's answer was a clear, powerful yes.
The ultimate holding was that the Texas statute violated the Due Process Clause, and in a huge move, they explicitly and totally overruled Bowers v. Hardwick.
Gone. And the reasoning for that is just a fascinating journey through how constitutional liberty has evolved. The court couldn't just say, we feel differently now. They had to show that this liberty was already part of our legal tradition.
So they looked at other landmark cases. We hear their names all the time. Griswold, Eisenstadt, Roe, Casey. How do cases about contraception and abortion build the foundation for this one?
They created what we call a constitutional sphere of liberty. Griswold protected marital privacy for contraception. Then Eisenstadt extended that same right to unmarried people.
Okay, so the right was expanding beyond just marriage.
Exactly. And then, crucially, you get Planned Parenthood v. Casey. Casey defined liberty as protecting the most intimate and personal choices that define who we are, our existence, our dignity, our destiny.
That's incredibly powerful language for a court ruling.
It is. And after Casey, the logic of Bowers just didn't hold up anymore. Bowers was an outlier. It went against this whole trajectory of the law that was expanding personal autonomy. Lawrence just brought the law back into alignment.
And there was another part to this, right? The court didn't just look at legal precedent, they looked at history. They basically said Bowers got the history wrong.
A critical part of the argument. The Bowers majority had suggested that laws against same-sex conduct were, ancient and universal. But the Lawrence court did a deeper dive and found that was, misleading.
How so? What was the misconception?
They found that early American and English laws, the ones often called sodomy laws, were much broader. They often targeted any non-procreative sex and were usually aimed at preventing non-consensual acts or protecting public morality.
Not policing what consenting adults did in private.
Rarely, if ever. Many of these were what we call dormant statutes on the books, but never enforced in that way. So this idea that there was a long, unbroken American tradition of criminalizing private same-sex intimacy was just not accurate.
So the historical pillar that Bowers was built on was basically just sand.
It was incredibly shaky. And once they dismantled the history, the court turned to Texas's justification for the law, and they concluded that it served no legitimate state interest.
Let's pause on that phrase, legitimate state interest. If a state can't just say, we think this is immoral, what kind of interest is actually legitimate enough for them to interfere in your private life?
Generally, it has to be about protecting public health, safety, or welfare, preventing harm. Think about laws against assault or public indecency or acts involving minors. There's a clear secular reason for those laws.
But moral disapproval alone?
Moral disapproval alone, the court said, cannot stand up to constitutional scrutiny. The Texas law was targeting a class of people without any real public harm reason, which made the law seem arbitrary and discriminatory.
Which brings us back to the fact that this was a victory on two fronts. The ruling hit both due process and equal protection. Can you break down what each one did?
Sure. The due process part is about liberty for everyone. It says the government's reason for this law is illegitimate, period. So the law is unconstitutional, because it infringes on the private autonomy we all possess.
Okay, that's the broad protection.
Right. But the equal protection part adds another critical layer. It says, even if you could argue there's some state interest here, this specific law is still unconstitutional because it unfairly targets only this one group.
So it's a double shield, protecting the conduct and protecting the people.
Exactly. It creates a very robust protection.
Let's shift a bit now to the human impact. Beyond the legal theory, what did this mean for the people involved, for the entire community?
I mean, it meant everything. This wasn't just an academic exercise. It was about the right to exist without being branded a criminal by your own government. The court specifically talked about the stigma these laws created.
It wasn't just a fine. It had real-world consequences.
Huge consequences. It created a criminal class which could affect your job, your housing, your social standing. So by striking down the law, the court instantly decriminalized intimacy for people in 13 states that still had these laws on the books. It was a massive moment of liberation.
It validated the idea that you have a fundamental right to build your own life.
Precisely. Justice Kennedy, who wrote the opinion, said the petitioners were entitled to respect for their private lives. He affirmed their right to control their own destiny.
So why are we still talking about it so much today? How does a 2003 case still show up in the news?
Because Lawrence v. Texas is the necessary foundation for so many modern autonomy debates. You can't get to marriage equality, for example, without it.
You mean the Obergefell case a decade later?
Yes. The logic flows directly. If the government cannot criminalize your private same-sex relationship, then it becomes very hard for the government to argue that it can refuse to recognize that same relationship.
So any debate we have now about privacy or family rights has to start with the strong definition of liberty that was established in Lawrence.
It's the cornerstone. And it really marked a huge shift in the American legal system, moving away from legislating private morality and more toward respecting personal choice.
Now, we have to acknowledge that these landmark cases are almost always divisive. The argument didn't just stop in 2003. Where does the disagreement still come from?
It really comes from that classic tension in our system. The state's power to legislate for the public good versus an individual's constitutional liberty. The dissenters in Lawrence argued that the court had overstepped.
How so?
They argued that the majority was wrong to overturn a clear precedent like Bowers, and that they were basically substituting their own judgment for that of state legislatures. They saw it as judges making law, which they believed should be left to the democratic process.
So it's not just about the outcome, but a debate over who gets to decide what liberty means, judges or voters.
That's at the heart of it. And the court in this case came down firmly on one side, affirming that when these fundamental liberties are on the line, they are protected by the Constitution, even from a majority's moral disapproval.
So let's bring it all home. The core rule from Lawrence v. Texas is that private, consensual adult conduct is a protected liberty.
And the ultimate takeaway for you, the listener, is the court's incredibly powerful affirmation that the Constitution draws a line around your personal life, creating a space where the government cannot easily intrude.
A space that protects your most intimate decisions about your relationships and your life. It guarantees that if the government wants to interfere, it needs a real, legitimate, secular reason. It can't just be because they disagree with you.
And that demand, that the state must have a legitimate interest beyond simple moral judgment, is what makes Lawrence such a powerful and enduring defense of individual freedom. It established that liberty isn't just about being left alone. It's about the constitutional right to build your own life. That right to define your own existence, that's the true victory of Lawrence v. Texas.
You've been listening to The Daily Brief, one landmark court decision explained in plain English every day. Presented by FindCourtCases.com, this is your daily briefing on the law that shapes American life. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow with the next case.